UFC President Dana White doesn't want to give Khabib Nurmagomedov the GOAT title, even though many fans and spectators see Khabib that way. But the UFC president definitely has some reasons for that. Here's everything we know. First off, why not Khabib? A lot of people would think of the retired ex-UFC lightweight champion Khabib Nurmagomedov as the finest fighter to come out of the sport in all time. Besides retiring with an undefeated record and his last fight being an excellent win against a game fighter, the Eagle has defeated and even dismantled many of the top names in the UFC's lightweight division. But apparently not everyone thinks he deserves the title of GOAT. The UFC president is too ready to give that to Nurmagomedov. He recently had an Actually Me segment on GQ where he explained why this is. He first admitted while Khabib is definitely talented enough to deserve that title, he didn't reach his full potential as he retired too early. We don't know how the rest of his career would have played out. He further elaborated saying, quote, "Believe me when I tell you I've tried to convince Khabib to come out of retirement. We'll see what happens over the next couple of years, but I just feel like he left him in his prime. Look at what he did to Justin Gaethje right before he retired. Next up, if not Khabib, then who is the GOAT?" Anyways, when it comes to the GOAT debate, White does think of one name, and that is Jon Jones, because there's a high chance Jones is going to fight at heavyweight sometime this year. Whatever your opinion on this guy is, it would be hard to find a reason not to give him the title of GOAT. We can understand why White would say that now. After all, Khabib did retire at age 32 with a record of 29-0. On the bright side, if his coach Javier Mendez is to be believed, he might make a comeback if Charles Oliveira wins against Islam Makhachev at UFC 280. Here are the fighters White really respects. White recently revealed his top 3 MMA fighters of all time. He's also told us the name of the current UFC champion who's making his way up there after his domination in the octagon. White was questioned about his MMA GOAT debate before the blockbuster UFC heavyweight champion clash between Cyril Gane and Francis Ngannou. And of course, everyone noticed how he casually omitted the obvious choice Khabib Nurmagomedov and Demetrius Johnson, Mighty Mouse. He instead named Jon Jones, Anderson Silva, and Georges St. Pierre as the 3 greatest fighters in MMA history. While on the Dave Portnoy show, the UFC boss also pointed out the 170 pounds king Kamaru Usman, saying he's getting up there during the GOAT conversation. Jones, Silva, and St. Pierre being named by Dana as the 3 best fighters present in MMA shouldn't come as a big shocker anymore. They're actually the best to compete in the UFC. Take Silva for example. He can boast an amazing 10 UFC middleweight title defenses. GSP dominated the UFC welterweight division and bagged the UFC title in a second division, defeating Michael Bisping to get the UFC middleweight championship. Now, about Jones, who's currently on the UFC roster, he cleared out the UFC light heavyweight division, defeating a string of excellent fighters in a legendary run at 205 pounds. Next up, why Kamaru Usman is definitely a GOAT. Cut to the present day, Usman the Nigerian Nightmare is the #1 ranked pound-for-pound fighter in the UFC. Usman has won 15 consecutive fights in the UFC, 5 of which were defenses of his UFC welterweight crown, which was unfortunately recently taken away from him by Leon Edwards. Hopefully Usman can get himself together and reclaim his crown. If he can manage that, he'll be on his way to establish his legacy. Let's not forget that he's beaten the likes of many legendary fighters. Surely we can allow the guy one defeat. He beat Tyron Woodley once too, and George Masvidal and Colby Covington twice each. Now about the debate around Jones, whether or not Jones is the GOAT. Bones has cleared out the UFC light heavyweight division, defending his title against some of the biggest names in the sport, since he's vacated his belt because he plans to try his luck at the UFC heavyweight division with a bout versus whomever wins the match of Stipe Miocic versus Francis Ngannou II on the cards. Finally, let's give Khabib some credit. However, even though White won't call him the GOAT, it was Khabib's name he took as the greatest fighter at the present moment. Even though he's retired, White just really wanted the guy to see things through to the end, but we can understand why he'd retire at the time too. His record was flawless. Retirement would make sure he stayed that way. The UFC president has since even engaged in talks with the Eagle about a comeback to the octagon, but the chances of that happening honestly don't look very high. White continued. He then called Khamzat Chimaev the UFC fighter he's most excited about. The Russian-born Swedish fighter became famous a year ago after making his heroics on Fight Island before starching Gerald Meerschaert within an insane 17 seconds. Holland reeled off 5 excellent UFC wins in 2020 and became a big player in the division after defeating Jacour Souza. Other related news, now who is the 17-year-old that impressed Dana White? The UFC president bet on and booked 17-year-old prospect Paul Rosas Jr. He's now going to have a match on Tuesday's Dana White's Contender Series fight card. Rosas is the youngest fighter to have ever fought in this promotion, and admittedly, he looked pretty impressive. He dominated Mando Gutierrez and took the win via unanimous decision. Rosas is also the youngest fighter to ever get a UFC contract. Dana praised him a lot during the event's post-fight press conference and UFC Apex. He also pointed out how, despite his age, he conducted himself amazingly and fought well. He even went so far as to use the words, "blown away." That's pretty big. White is not easily impressed. This kid must be something special. Rosas is currently in the bantamweight division. He had his first amateur fight at 15 and went pro in November. Within less than a year, Rosas had racked himself up an undefeated 6-0 record. No wonder White was so blown away. Next up, Joe Rogan says he will leave when White does. Rogan has stated that he and Dana White come as a package deal. The famous podcaster and comedian has been a fixture of the UFC's broadcast desk for over 20 years. Joe Rogan is now 55, and he works much less events now than he did in the past, but he is still the head color commentator for the majority of UFC's domestic pay-per-views, and his voice stays a familiar part of many of the most iconic moments in the sport. Now, we know that won't change as long as White sticks around as the president. He explicitly said in a recent episode of the JRE, Joe Rogan Experience, his podcast, that as soon as Dana White leaves, so will he. That's also part of his contract. In 2022, Rogan is one of the longest tenured people in the organization. His debut even took place all the way back in 1997, when Rogan first came on as a backstage interviewer at UFC 12. In the years that passed from then and now, he's turned into one of the most widely recognized faces of the company. In 2020, Rogan signed a big deal with Spotify. It was for over $100 million for his podcast rights, and it stays one of the most listened to in the world, so Rogan won't be lacking things to do once he leaves the UFC. We know he'll be just fine whenever his UFC tenure is completed, but don't worry, it's not happening anytime in the near future. Finally, here's Silva's issue with the UFC. It's been nearly 2 years since the Spider split ways with the promotion. That was his home from 2006 through 2020, and presently he's looking forward to a highly anticipated boxing match against the former YouTube star Jake Paul that is scheduled for October 29th in Glendale, Arizona. At an appearance on the MMA Hour, Silva talked about Paul's highly publicized rivalry with White over fighter salary before giving his own 2 cents on the intricate relationship between the promotion and its fighters. Silva said that he can jot down 2 things, of them being the issue that the Paul brothers tried to bring attention to, which is something very important: the fighters' paychecks. He pointed out how fighters usually steer clear of that side of the business because they're so busy training and practicing their fighting skills. They don't have time to be worried about the business aspect, and so they have managers and whatnot, but they often don't get a fair deal. He admitted that while White tries his best, he's actually never fought in a match, and so he won't know what it's really like. He's a businessman at the end of the day. Silva also constantly emphasizes how fighters should make use of the platform they get, and gave the Paul brothers as a perfect example. They've both used their clout to successfully change careers, and they've been pretty successful at it too. That's a wrap for this video. Do you agree with White? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this one. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you in the next video.